Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, we're headed to Galena, Illinois in the spring of 1860. The United States are still whole, but the nation is bitterly divided on the subject of slavery, and partisan politics have compromised the Congress and the rule of law. Just a few months earlier, in September 1859, John Brown led a failed slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and just a few months into the future, lay a presidential election that would send Abraham Lincoln to the White House. His victory prompted South Carolina to secede from the Union and more states to follow. It was not a peaceful transfer of power. In Galena, during that eventful spring of 1860, a man named Augustus Louis Chetlain, a successful businessman, is just returning from a sojourn in Europe. He had made a lot of money and decided to travel to Europe and enjoy life for a while. When he returned during his absence, a newcomer had arrived in town, former U.S. Army Captain Ulysses S. Grant. He's pictured here in one of my most favorite images of him after he became the success that we know today, posed in a studio with revolving cameras to take multiple pictures of him. Of course, back in the spring of 1860, he was largely unknown. Dismissed from the military, he had struggled to find himself. Grant had moved to Galena, hoping to get a fresh start in the family's tanning business. Chetlain shared his impressions and memories of Captain Grant in the spring of 1860 in his 1899 memoir, Recollections of 70 Years. I'm going to read the relevant passage to you. He talks about Grant's personality and his politics. So here we go. In Chetlain's words, I first met Captain U.S. Grant, an ex-captain of the United States Army, in the spring of 1860 at Galena on my return from Europe. He had come there from St. Louis during my absence abroad to take a position as a clerk in the wholesale and retail leather store of J.R. Grant and Company, his father. That's Jesse Root Grant, his father being the senior member of the firm. He filled the place in the store of his older brother, Simpson Grant, who had been incapacitated by sickness and who died the year after. Captain Grant, after having left the Army some 6 years before, had been engaged in farming near the city of St. Louis, but had met with poor success. He brought his family, consisting of his wife and 4 children, from St. Louis in the spring of 1860. He rented a comfortable brick house at the rental corresponding with his salary, which was less than $1,000 a year. In the store, he was really more than an ordinary clerk, for at times he was a salesman and at other times a collector, going out to country towns and occasionally doing the work of a bookkeeper. The firm had no tannery in Galena, but bought green hides in the Galena market, shipped them to Coddington, Kentucky, where the tannery was located, and after having tanned them, reshipped them to Galena. Grant led a quiet life and seemed little inclined to make the acquaintance of his fellow citizens, but was highly esteemed by all who knew him. With his family, he was a regular attendant at the Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a free and interesting talker and frequently entertained his friends and neighbors by the hour in relating his experiences in the Mexican War and while stationed a few years on the Pacific coast. He was not an active politician, but took a deep interest in all political questions before the country. Although a Whig in early life, he supported Mr. Buchanan, James Buchanan, for the presidency, but became a free soil Democrat before the end of his administration. He took little part in the exciting campaign of 1860, but favored the election of Senator Douglas for president and would have voted for him had his time of residence in Illinois given him the right to vote. So there's the end of the passage written by Augustus Chetlain about former Captain Ulysses S. Grant, describing him as a chatty guy who liked to talk about his experiences in Mexico and the Pacific coast, not particularly active in politics, but interested in political questions, a Democrat who became disillusioned with James Buchanan, like many Americans, and turned to Stephen Douglas and the Free Soil faction to be able to hopefully bring the country back together. So, an interesting view of Grant just months before the election of Abraham Lincoln, with whom he was so closely associated just a few years after the presidential election. Now, a footnote, you may be wondering what happened to Chetlain. A year later, after his spring 1860 recollection, when the Civil War began, Galena's townspeople met and passed resolutions in support of the Union. They also determined to form a military company and nominated Grant to organize the local men. Chetlain was Grant's first recruit, and he went on to command the company that became part of the 12th Illinois Infantry. Chetlain soon advanced to lieutenant colonel, second in command of the regiment, distinguished himself in the Battle of Fort Donelson, Grant's great victory that elevated him to national attention with the words unconditional surrender, and Chetlain received a promotion to colonel and regimental command for gallantry at Donelson. Grant then elevated Chetlain to brigadier general and assigned him the task of organizing and training U.S. colored troops. That was in early 1864. Chetlain ended the war as a major general in 1866, served as a consul in the Grant administration, and was active in business and philanthropy. He lived until 1914, dying at age 89. So there you have the story of Chetlain, his relationship with Grant, being Grant's first recruit in Galena when they were forming that company to support the Union. Of course, the look at Grant through Chetlain's eyes, just returning from Europe and finding out about this newcomer in town, this chatty guy talking about his Mexican War experiences. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.